Okay, now that we have movement working, the next thing I want to do is add a hazard so that if our player bumps it, they have to respawn. So you can think of it as like spikes or a fire or even a bottomless pit if you wanted to do that. So in order to start testing this, I'm going to have to do a little bit of work on our test level here. So I'm just going to duplicate the floor and just kind of make a wall over here like so. And I'll do sort of the same thing on this also, just to kind of keep our player wrapped inside of this area. And if I look at the game window, I can see kind of how it looks. So if I run it, the player can't escape. And I'm going to go ahead and start, so I'll stop the game. I'm going to move the player back in the scene window. I'm going to move him so he starts up here. And this is just going to make it really evident. To begin with, I'm going to make it very evident where the player has started. And so once you've walked down here, we know that you've been playing for a little bit. Because this way, when you touch our spikes or our hazard, I'm just going to reload the level, and I want to make sure I can tell that the player's actually back where they started. Alright, so now that I've got the level set up, I guess I need to make a new sprite that I will use for the hazard. So let's go into our sprites folder, and I'm going to go right click and go to the create menu, find sprites, and I make a triangle. This will work for a spike. Let's drag it like right here, sure. And I will rename it, instead of triangle, let's call it hazard. And I guess while I'm at it, I can rename these too. So let's call this slow floor right wall, because that's really actually what it is. And this one will be the floor left wall, something like that anyway. Now, maybe I'll change the color of my hazard so it's easier to see. We can make it red like danger. There we go. And I think now we need to make a script for it. So I'll go to the scripts folder here. I will right click, create C# script, and let's name this one hazard. And then we will double click it to open it in Visual Studio. Alright, and so now we just have the basic template of a script. And so I want to point out, normally when you make a function, like if you look at our player character, we wrote this update is on ground function. We wrote the update physics material function. When you have a function like this, the code inside doesn't get called automatically. The code inside will only be executed when you actually call the function. So you can see update is on ground. It's being called here in update. Update physics materials being called here in fixed update. Move is being called in fixed update. So the only reason that all this code is getting called is because the function that the code lives inside of is being called. But you might wonder a little bit about the start and update functions. We're never actually explicitly calling these. They get called instead automatically by the Unity engine at certain points in the lifespan of your game. So for example, start will be called when the scene loads, and update is called every single frame, right? But we're not actually manually calling it. The engine's calling it. Well, there are several more of these built-in Unity API functions that get called automatically by the game engine at certain points. And the one that we are going to want to use for our hazard is called Ontriggerenter 2D. Just 2D because it's a 2D game. So I'm gonna start typing on trigger enter, and then we'll see there's on trigger enter 2D. And as you might suspect, this one gets automatically called by the game engine when something enters a trigger that is attached to the same game object that this hazard script will be on. So before we get carried away, maybe we better set that up in the editor. So let's save our script. Let's go back to the editor, and we can click on our hazard here. And we better, before we forget, add the hazard script to it. And then we will also want to add a trigger to it, because nothing can enter its trigger unless we actually give it a trigger. So remember, triggers are just colliders with the is trigger checkbox checked. So we want to pick, since this hazard, it'll feel like the game's kind of jipping us if we don't actually touch what looks like will hurt us. We're going to have to pick a hitbox for it that seems to fit it fairly well. So for example, if I were to just put a box collider 2D on this, just touching this part that doesn't look like it's dangerous, this space, would kill the player eventually when I write that code. And that would feel cheap to someone, to a player. If anything, we want to cheat in favor of the player and let them think that they're really good at the game and barely made it. But we definitely don't want to kill them when it looks like they shouldn't have taken damage. So we don't want to use a box collider. We don't want to use a circle collider, because neither of these really match up with this artwork. So I'm going to remove the box collider, and let's add a Polygon Collider 2D. And you can see that will automatically try to come in right around the perimeter of our sprite artwork. So it's working really well for this triangle. So we'll use the Polygon Collider 2D. It's got a very nicely mapped hitbox, but we need to make sure we check the is trigger button here. And that way we can make sure that our on trigger enter 2D function here will get called when the player bumps into it. If you wanted to make it a hard collision, you would not check the trigger, and you could use on collider or on collision enter 2D, which it's worth pointing out they have just a slightly different signature to these things. So this one takes a collider 2D argument. This one takes a collision 2D argument. And personally, my design sense is that the player, I don't want him standing on top of the spikes. I want him to like fall into them. So I'm going to make it a trigger. But if you want to make it a collider, that's, it's your game. So anyway, I'm going to get rid of the on collision enter and keep going ahead with on trigger enter. And so first we should just sort of see if this is actually working the way we expect. So we're going to say debug.log something entered the trigger, except spell it right. We can even call it the hazard to be more specific. Okay, now let's save that, and we will run the game and see what happens. Looks like nothing. Well, let's see what happens if our player runs into it. And sure enough, it did actually print that something entered the hazard. Well, this seems like it's going to work for us, but technically we have a little bit of a bug where what if we have crates or enemies or something that's allowed to touch the hazard? We don't want an enemy to touch the hazard and then that causes the player to respawn, or like a crate to fall down on the hazard and cause the player to die. So we need to, just to demonstrate that, I guess, let's just make a box. We'll go back to our sprites. Let's put a square here. Let's change the color so it's not to be confused with the player, it will just be like a box. Brown color. I'll make it smaller than the player too, so that it's just different. I'm going to add a box collider 2D, and I'm going to add a rigid body 2D. And so now it's essentially a physics object here. I'll set it right on my ice that I've got. This level, by the way, if you're making a real game, you want to make sure everything is snapped to the grid. You don't want to get sloppy with your level design like I am, because things will get caught on these uneven surfaces. But I'm just trying to quickly prototype some gameplay, and when we get to the level part, we will be more careful. We'll probably use a tile map that will just clearly be stuck to a grid. Anyhow, if I run the game now, my box landed on the ice, and I can kick it into the hazard, and you can see it says something entered the hazard. So I don't want that to kill my player. So we need to somehow distinguish the difference between when the player touches the hazard, when the box touches the hazard. And so the way that I'm going to do that is by using the tag system of Unity. So real quick, I'm going to rename this square to box or crate, I guess, just to keep stuff straight. Then let's click on the player, and you'll see that every game object has this little bit in the inspector where you can assign a tag. Now there's some tags that are built in already, and you can also add your own custom tags if you wanted, which I don't really need to though, because there's actually a built-in one that will work for what we want to do. So if we look at, again, click on your player character, look at this list, you'll see there's actually already a tag for player. And so we will tag our player character game object as the player. And then we can go into our script for the hazard, and we can check and see if the thing that touched it actually was tagged as the player or not. So we can just add an if statement here, and we'll say if, so we know this argument here, this is a reference to what actually touched the trigger. So we're going to look at this thing. So we're going to say if collision dot game object, so this is the game object that touched the trigger, dot tag, or we can use the compare tag method, why not? And so we want to see if it says player. Now be careful that you type player in exactly as it's typed in the list of tags here. So it's capital P. So if the collision.gameObject.compareTag player, so this will resolve to true if the tag matches that text exactly. Then we can print something special like debug.log player entered hazard. And otherwise, if something else that's not the player touches it, so we'll have an else, and we'll just move this up in there and indent it correctly. You can hold the Alt key and then use the arrows to move lines around like that. And let's type a little bit more clear of a message. We'll say something other than the player entered the hazard. And we'll save that. And let's go back to Unity and see what this does. So we'll start off by pushing our crate into the hazard and see what the console says. Something other than the player entered the hazard. Alright, now let's see what happens if I walk in. Player entered the hazard. So we're effectively detecting which type of thing touches the hazard. Is it something that's not the player, or is it the player? So the next step is to reload the game when the player touches it. Now, if you wanted to implement a health system or something like that, this is where you would actually, make your player take damage. We're going to at least start off by making this a one mess up and you die type of game, just because it's way easier. And then once we get that working, we can think about maybe adding a little bit deeper of game mechanics to taking damage or respawning. Alright, so let's go back to our code, and let's, besides just this log statement here, let's actually put some code in that will respawn the player. What we're going to do for now is simply just reload the scene. This will satisfy our requirements for now, and then, like I said, we can always we can improve this game mechanic as we go. So to reload a scene, we need to use something called the scene manager. And you'll notice when I start typing it in, it's underlined in red, and it says there isn't such a thing here. What are you talking about? But you also see it says show potential fixes, control period. So I'm going to go ahead and hit control period. And you're going to see that it's Visual Studio is suggesting that I add this using statement, Unity Engine.scene management. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can either click or hit enter. And now that I have the using statement for Unity Engine.scene management, all of a sudden we know what a scene manager is. And it's still underlined in red just because I'm not doing anything with it yet. I just typed it in, but you can tell it's recognized because it's colored in this blue color. So I'm going to say scene manager period, and then we're going to use a function built into the scene manager called load scene. And so we'll hit tab to have that auto-complete for us, and we can look and see that there are 4 versions of the scene manager.loadScene function. One takes in scene build index. So if you were to look at your Unity project file build settings, you have scenes in build, and the first scene comes in at index 0. So we could type in 0 here. That would reload the sample scene that we have. It's our only scene. And that should actually work. We can just test it real quick. So we'll say scene manager.load scene 0. So if the player, if something touches our hazard and it has the tag player, we're going to reload the level. Let's go back to the game and can close the scene manager here, or I mean the build settings, and we will run the game, and let's just see if I actually can die. Yeah, see, so if I touch that, just start over. Okay, now there's one issue that will come up is if you make a new level in your game, you're not going to be on scene index 0 anymore. You'll be on some other scene index. So we actually don't want to just hard code in the a 0 there. We will instead, we can actually get a reference to the current scene. So we'll say scene manager.load scene, and inside of the parentheses, let's type scene manager again. So scene manager dot get active scene. And so this is a function, so you have to have an open close parenthesis there. And you'll notice if I try to just leave it like that, that might sound like it should work, but this is going to return a object of the type scene, and our load scene function actually either needs a string or an int. So we can either get the name of the scene or we can get that build index. Either way will work. So we'll just hit, after our open close parenthesis for get active scene, we'll hit period, and again you can either choose build index or you could choose name also, either way. Maybe I'll go with name just because if I were ever debugging, the name is just a little easier for me to understand than a number. So I will save it, and we can go back to the game and test it out again, and it should still work in theory. Cool. So that will be our basic hazard gameplay for now. The next step will be to add checkpoints to our game so that if you hit a hazard and you can reload at a checkpoint instead of just starting the entire level over.